The boy is 4 years old when he first understands that God does not answer prayers. He kneels beside his bed in the parsonage at Röcken, hands pressed together the way his mother taught him, whispering into the darkness. His father is in the next room, and something is happening to him that no one will explain. For months now, the man who used to lift little Friedrich onto his shoulders and teach him hymns has been changing. Some days he doesn't recognize his own son. Some days he screams. Some days he just stares at the wall, drooling, while his mind goes somewhere the boy cannot follow. The parsonage walls are thick, built of stone that holds the cold even in summer, but they cannot contain the sounds that come from his father's room at night. The moaning, the sudden shouts that wake Friedrich from shallow sleep, the heavy footsteps of the doctor, and the hushed, urgent voices of the adults who gather in the hallway and speak in whispers they think the children cannot hear. Friedrich prays for his father to come back. He prays the way his father taught him to pray, with complete faith, with absolute certainty that someone is listening. Night after night he kneels and whispers his small, desperate hope into the silence. He makes bargains with God the way children do. He promises to be good forever, to never fight with his sister, to memorize every verse his father asks of him. He promises anything if only God will make his father well again. In the daytime, he tries to be helpful. He sits very still when adults are talking. He doesn't cry even when he wants to. He practices his piano lessons without being asked, because music made his father smile. And maybe if Friedrich plays well enough, that smile will return. He is trying to be perfect, trying to earn the miracle he needs, but his father does not come back. The man in the next room continues to dissolve, his brain softening like rotting fruit, until one morning, in July 1849, he simply stops breathing, and little Friedrich learns the first great lesson that will shape his entire life. There is no one listening. There is only the silence and the suffering and the terrible question that will haunt him for the next 40 years. The funeral is held on a bright summer day that feels like mockery. The church is full of parishioners who loved Pastor Nietzsche, who benefited from his kindness, who cannot understand why God would take such a good man at only 36 years old. They sing hymns about eternal life and reunion in heaven. They speak about God's mysterious plan, about how all things work together for good for those who love him. Friedrich, dressed in black that is too hot for the weather, stands beside his mother and does not sing. He watches them lower the coffin into the ground and thinks about the body inside it, the body that used to chase him through the garden, that used to play Beethoven on the piano with such grace that even the birds seemed to stop and listen. That body is rotting now. There is no plan. There is no mercy. There is only the earth taking back what it made. If God will not answer, if suffering has no meaning, if death comes for everyone regardless of their prayers or their virtue or their faith, then what is the point of any of it? Why go on living? And if we choose to go on living anyway in defiance of the meaninglessness, what must we become to do so honestly? Before we follow this question into the abyss it opened, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely matters to me, and I'm curious, where in the world are you joining me from today? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, let's descend into the darkness that shaped one of history's most radical minds. The year is 1844, and Prussia is a kingdom built on discipline, duty, and divine right. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche is born on October 15th in the village of Röcken, 50 miles from Leipzig, into a world that still believes it understands how everything fits together. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, is the local Lutheran pastor, a gentle, cultured man who plays the piano beautifully and composes devotional music. His mother, Franziska, is the daughter of another Lutheran pastor. The boy is named after the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, whose birthday he shares. Everything about his birth announces a destiny. He will follow his father and both his grandfathers into the ministry. He will be a man of God. The parsonage is filled with books and music. His father teaches him to read early, introduces him to poetry, sits him at the piano. Little Friedrich has quick fingers and an ear for melody that delights his father. They play duets together in the evenings, the father's deep bass notes grounding the son's tentative treble. These are the moments Friedrich will remember most clearly in later years. Not the theology, not the prayers, but the music. The way sound could create a world complete unto itself, needing no justification, no explanation, simply existing in its own perfection. The house feels safe, ordered, meaningful. Outside, Europe is convulsing. The revolutions of 1848 are spreading across the continent, old certainties cracking, but inside the parsonage, everything still makes sense. There is God, and there is duty, and there is the promise that virtue will be rewarded. And then, in 1848, his father begins to fall. At first, it's subtle: headaches, vision problems, episodes of confusion. Karl Ludwig forgets words in the middle of sermons. He stumbles on the church steps. He stares at the hymnal during services as if he's never seen it before. But within months, Karl Ludwig is in a state of complete mental collapse. The official diagnosis is softening of the brain, which means nothing except that something is eating his mind from the inside. Modern scholars suspect it was a brain tumor, or perhaps the same genetic vascular condition that will later claim Friedrich himself. But in 1848, the doctors can only watch and shake their heads. They try bloodletting, they try poultices and purgatives, they try everything except admitting they have no idea what's happening or how to stop it. For 11 months, Friedrich watches his father transform from the man who taught him hymns into something that barely seems human, a thing that howls in the night, a thing that has to be restrained when the rages come, a thing that looks at its own son without recognition, or worse, with a flicker of recognition that dissolves before it can become connection. The boy develops strategies for survival. He learns to become invisible when the adults are stressed. He learns to interpret his mother's face for signs of how bad things are today. He learns to comfort his younger sister Elizabeth, who cries easily and doesn't understand why Papa doesn't play with them anymore. He learns to sleep through the sounds from the next room, or at least to pretend he's sleeping. He learns that praying doesn't work, but he doesn't learn how to stop. No one explains this to the child. In 19th century Prussia, you do not explain such things to children. You simply expect them to pray harder. When Friedrich asks his mother what's wrong with Papa, she tells him that God is testing their faith. When he asks when Papa will get better, she says, only God knows. Every answer circles back to God, to faith, to the promise that suffering has meaning if you can just believe hard enough. But Friedrich is watching his father die by inches, and no amount of belief is stopping it. When Karl Ludwig finally dies on July 30th, 1849, Friedrich has learned something more than grief. He has learned that the world his father preached about, the world where faith is rewarded and suffering has meaning, is a lie, or if not exactly a lie, then a story that reality does not respect. You can be good and devoted and faithful and pious, and your brain will still dissolve. Your children will still kneel beside their beds and beg a silent heaven for help that never comes. 6 months later, his 2-year-old brother Joseph dies suddenly, probably of measles. The family is shattered. In less than a year, Friedrich has lost every male figure in his life. The family is forced to leave the parsonage. It belongs to the church, and without Pastor Nietzsche, they have no claim to it. They move to the nearby city of Naumburg to live with his grandmother. The household becomes entirely female: his mother, grandmother, 2 maiden aunts, and his younger sister, Elizabeth. He is the only male in a house of widows and spinsters, surrounded by Lutheran piety and female tears. The women cry often, but quietly, as if loud grief would be unseemly. They wear black for years. They speak of his father in hushed, reverent tones, transforming the confused, dying man Friedrich remembers into a plaster saint. The pressure on Friedrich is immense, though mostly unspoken. He is the man of the family now at age 5. He is expected to redeem the loss by becoming what his father was, only better, perfect, flawless, a vessel for the family's hopes and the dead man's interrupted destiny. He grows up careful, polite, preternaturally well-behaved. His schoolmates at the local grammar school call him the little pastor because he's so serious, so dutiful, so obviously destined for the clergy. He writes earnest essays about faith. He composes devotional poetry that makes his teachers weep. Every adult who meets him sees the same thing: a brilliant, sensitive boy who will restore his family's honor by becoming an even greater pastor than his father. At home, he reads voraciously. The house may be sad, but it still has books: his father's theological library, German poetry, classical literature. Friedrich devours everything. He reads Hölderlin and Goethe. He discovers the ancient Greeks, Homer first, then the tragedians. He learns that there were civilizations that faced death without the comfort of resurrection, that built meaning without the promise of heaven. But something else is growing underneath the performance. A question, a doubt, a small, stubborn refusal that he cannot yet articulate, but that throbs in his chest like a second heartbeat. When the pastor at church speaks about God's love, Friedrich thinks about his father's screams. When they sing hymns about divine providence, he remembers the smell of the sick room. When they pray, he hears only silence. He doesn't reject faith, not consciously. He's too young, too conditioned, too afraid of disappointing the women who have pinned all their hopes on him. But something in him refuses to fully surrender to the narrative they're offering. Some part of him remains separate, watching, waiting to see if any of this will prove to be true. In 1858, at age 14, he wins a scholarship to Schulpforta, one of the most prestigious boarding schools in Germany. It's a brutal place, all discipline and classical education, where boys study Greek and Latin for 14 hours a day and are beaten for the smallest infractions. The school has educated Fichte and Schlegel and other luminaries of German culture. The expectations are crushing. The journey to Schulpforta is Friedrich's first time away from his family for an extended period. His mother weeps as she helps him pack his trunk. She is losing her little pastor, sending him into a world she fears will corrupt him. Elizabeth clings to him at the train station, making him promise to write every week, to pray every night, to remember who he is. But who is he really? That's the question Friedrich cannot yet articulate as the train carries him away from Naumburg toward his new life. The dutiful son, the future pastor, the serious boy who writes devotional poetry, or something else entirely, something he hasn't yet discovered? Schulpforta reveals the answer. The school is ancient, founded in 1543, its buildings grey stone and Gothic arches that speak of centuries of tradition. When Friedrich arrives in October, the autumn leaves are falling in the courtyard, and the place feels less like a school than a monastery, which in fact it once was. The discipline is immediate and total. The boys rise at 5 in the morning for prayers. They wash in cold water regardless of the weather. They dress in uniform dark suits and gather for morning roll call, where infractions from the previous day are publicly announced and punished. Then breakfast, thin porridge and black bread, eaten in silence while a senior student reads from Luther's Bible. Classes begin at 6 and continue, with only brief breaks until 8 in the evening. Greek grammar, Latin composition, ancient history, mathematics, German literature. The teachers are exacting, demanding perfection, accepting no excuses. A mistranslation in Greek class earns a rap across the knuckles with a wooden ruler. Slouching during lectures means standing for the remainder of the period. Falling asleep, and boys do fall asleep, exhausted from the relentless schedule, results in public humiliation and extra assignments. The older boys enforce an additional layer of control. There is a hierarchy, brutal in its clarity. First-year students are the lowest, subject to arbitrary commands from their seniors: fetch my books, polish my shoes, copy my Latin homework. Friedrich learns quickly that resistance only makes things worse. He learns to be invisible, to anticipate what is wanted, to move through the school's complex social geography without drawing attention. But Friedrich thrives there in ways that surprise even him. Away from the morning house in Naumburg, away from his mother's sad eyes and the constant pressure to be the perfect Christian son, he discovers that he has a gift for languages, for philology, for understanding how words work and what they hide. Within his first month, his Greek teacher notices something unusual. Friedrich doesn't just translate mechanically following grammatical rules. He understands rhythm, style, the way ancient Greek poetry works as sound and sense simultaneously. When they read Homer, Friedrich hears the hexameters as music. When they pass Sophocles, he grasps not just what the words mean, but what they're doing, how the chorus functions, how the dialogue reveals character, how the whole tragedy builds toward its terrible revelation. His essays begin to attract attention. While other boys produce dutiful summaries of classical texts, Friedrich writes interpretative pieces that show genuine insight. He compares Aeschylus and Sophocles, analyzing how their different styles reflect different visions of fate and human agency. He writes about the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, Parmenides, with a passion that goes beyond mere academic interest. The teachers don't quite know what to make of him. He's brilliant, certainly, but there's something troubling about the directions his mind goes. When they study Plato, Friedrich writes an essay questioning whether Socrates' rationalism might have destroyed something valuable in Greek culture. It's a sophisticated argument for a 15-year-old, but it also suggests a dangerous tendency toward independent thought. Schulpforta is medieval in its structure, a former Cistercian monastery converted into an educational institution. The boys sleep in cold dormitories, wake at 5 for prayers, spend their days conjugating Greek verbs and parsing Latin poetry. They are beaten for speaking German instead of Latin during lessons. They are beaten for slouching, they are beaten for dreaming. Friedrich learns to endure. More than endure, he learns to excel. He discovers that when he's translating Sophocles or analyzing the meter of Horace, something in him comes alive that has nothing to do with duty or pleasing his mother or living up to his dead father's legacy. This is something pure, something his own. He reads the Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and finds in them something his father's Christianity never gave him, a vision of nobility in the face of meaningless suffering. The tragic heroes don't pray to be saved. They don't assume the universe cares about their fate. They face their doom with eyes open, without illusions, and in that clear-eyed confrontation with fate, they become something more than merely human. Prometheus chained to the rock for defying Zeus. Oedipus blinding himself when he discovers the truth. Antigone choosing death rather than compromising her values. These figures speak to something in Friedrich that hymns and prayers never touched. They suffered without the promise of redemption. They died without hope of resurrection. And yet they were magnificent. He begins writing his own poetry and essays, trying to capture this tragic vision. His teachers praise his work but gently suggest he should focus on more Christian themes. He writes papers on theological topics that demonstrate perfect understanding of Lutheran doctrine. But in his private notebooks he copies out passages from the Greeks, from the pre-Socratic philosophers, from anyone who seemed to see the world clearly without the veil of religious comfort. He also makes a few close friends at Schulpforta, Paul Deussen and Karl von Gersdorf, boys who share his passion for ideas and music. They form a little society they call Germania, where they share their poems and essays and talk about philosophy late into the night until the monitors come to enforce lights out. These friendships are Friedrich's first experience of intellectual companionship, of being understood by peers rather than merely approved of by authorities. But he keeps his deepest thoughts to himself. He still writes home about his faith. He still plans to study theology at university. He is, after all, a good son. The performance continues, but the gap between the performance and his private thoughts grows wider with each year. In 1864, he enrolls at the University of Bonn to study theology and philology, hedging his bets, keeping one foot in each world. His mother and sister expect great things. The family's honor will be restored. Friedrich will become a pastor, just as was always intended. The university is his first taste of real freedom. Away from the monastic discipline of Schulpforta, he discovers beer and student societies. He joins a dueling fraternity, more to fit in than from any real enthusiasm. He drinks more than is good for him. He stays up late arguing about politics and philosophy with other students who are equally young and equally certain they understand the world. But he's also beginning to fracture. The theology lectures bore him. They seem to be answering questions no one is asking, defending positions that only make sense if you've already decided to believe them. The philology, though, that comes alive for him. His professor, Friedrich Nietzsche, is one of the great classical scholars of the age, and he recognizes in young Nietzsche something rare, not just intelligence, but genuine originality of thought. And then, one afternoon in a used bookshop in Cologne, he picks up a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. He buys it on impulse, carries it back to his room, and begins to read. Everything changes. Schopenhauer tells him that the world is not governed by a benevolent God with a plan. It is governed by a blind, striving force, what he calls the will, that creates life only so that life can suffer. Existence is pain. Consciousness is a mistake. The only wisdom is to deny the will, to retreat from life, to extinguish the self in ascetic renunciation. It should be the most depressing philosophy imaginable, but to young Friedrich it feels like liberation, because Schopenhauer is the first person who has told him the truth he learned watching his father die, the truth that all the pastors and teachers have been trying to hide from him with their lies about providence and divine plans. Life is suffering. There is no meaning. Death comes for everyone. Schopenhauer confirms what Friedrich has suspected since he was 4 years old. The universe does not care about us. We are alone. And, strangely, terribly, this truth makes him feel less alone, because if Schopenhauer is right, then Friedrich's inability to believe is not a moral failure or a weakness of character. It's clear-sightedness, it's honesty. All those people singing hymns and talking about God's plan, they're the ones in denial. They're the ones refusing to look at reality. For weeks, Friedrich barely leaves his room except to attend lectures. He reads Schopenhauer obsessively, marking up the pages, copying out passages, feeling like he's finally found the words for what he's been thinking in silence for years. His friends notice the change. He's more withdrawn, more intense, more prone to dark moods. But he can't explain to them what's happening. How do you tell people that you've just discovered your entire upbringing was based on a lie? Schopenhauer becomes his new scripture. Where he used to carry a Bible, he now carries the world as will and representation. But where he used to quote Luther, he now quotes Schopenhauer. His theology professors notice his declining interest. His mother, when he goes home for holidays, worries about him. He seems different, harder, less like the sweet boy who left for university. Within months, he abandons theology completely. He transfers to the University of Leipzig to study only philology, following his brilliant professor Friedrich Nietzsche, who sees in young Nietzsche an almost supernatural talent for understanding ancient languages. His mother is devastated, his family is scandalized, but Friedrich has made his choice. He cannot spend his life preaching a God he knows is dead. The break costs him. His mother cries. His aunts speak of disappointment and wasted potential. His sister, Elizabeth, who at 16 is already showing signs of the rigid piety and nationalism that will define her later years, accuses him of betraying their father's memory. The family's expectation, the weight of it, the certainty that he would redeem the loss by becoming a pastor, has shaped his entire life. And now he's throwing it away, but he cannot go back. Schopenhauer has shown him that intellectual honesty demands following truth wherever it leads, regardless of comfort or social expectation. And the truth, as Friedrich now understands it, is that Christianity is a beautiful lie told by people too weak to face reality. But if there is no God, and if Schopenhauer is right that life is only suffering, then why go on living? This is the question that begins to burn in him. Schopenhauer's answer, quietism, withdrawal, the extinction of desire, feels like a kind of cowardice. Friedrich is only 20 years old, but he already knows that he does not want to escape from life. He wants to find a way to say yes to it, even knowing what he knows, especially knowing what he knows. He needs a new answer, a different path, something that Schopenhauer didn't see. In November 1868, Friedrich meets the man who will change his life and nearly destroy it. Richard Wagner is already one of the most famous composers in Europe, a towering figure who believes he is single-handedly reviving German culture through his music dramas. He is 55 years old, supremely confident, magnetically charismatic, and utterly convinced of his own genius. Friedrich is 24, shy, uncertain, desperate for a father figure to replace the one he lost 20 years ago. They meet at the home of Wagner's sister in Leipzig, and the older man is immediately taken with this intense young scholar who understands Greek tragedy and speaks passionately about music. Wagner, for all his egotism, has a genius for recognizing talent and a collector's instinct for surrounding himself with brilliant young men who will serve his vision. Within weeks, Friedrich is visiting Wagner and his partner Cosima at their villa at Tribschen on Lake Lucerne. The villa is a kind of artistic kingdom in miniature. Wagner holds court, working on his operas, entertaining visitors, delivering monologues about art and culture and the future of Germany. Cosima, the illegitimate daughter of Franz Liszt, manages the household with aristocratic grace while still technically married to the conductor Hans von Bülow. The entire setup is scandalous and glorious. Within months, Friedrich has become part of the inner circle, spending Christmas at Tribschen, helping proofread Wagner's autobiography, becoming the intimate confidant of the couple. For Wagner's birthday in 1870, Friedrich arranges a surprise musical performance outside the villa at dawn. The relationship feels like everything Friedrich has been missing: intellectual stimulation, artistic intensity, a sense of being part of something historically significant. For Friedrich, Wagner represents everything Schopenhauer was not: life-affirming, creative, Dionysian. Wagner's music seems to touch something primal and true, something that transcends rationality and reaches into the will itself. When Friedrich listens to Wagner's operas, he feels something he hasn't felt since his father played piano with him as a child, a sense that reality has depths that words cannot reach, that art can be a form of truth deeper than philosophy. In Wagner's presence, Friedrich feels that he has found not just a mentor, but a mission to become the philosophical voice of a new German culture that will be born from Wagner's music. He envisions himself as the theorist of a cultural revolution, the one who will explain what Wagner is doing and why it matters. The student who abandoned theology has found a new gospel to preach. His life moves with shocking speed. In 1869, on Ritschl's recommendation, the University of Basel offers Friedrich an extraordinary professorship in classical philology. Extraordinary because he hasn't even completed his doctorate yet. He is 24 years old. The University of Leipzig, on Ritschl's urging, awards him a doctorate without requiring a thesis or examination based solely on his published articles. He renounces his Prussian citizenship to take the Swiss position. He becomes Professor Nietzsche, the youngest person ever appointed to a chair at Basel. Everything seems to be falling into place. He has escaped his destined path into the ministry. He has found a new father in Wagner, one who is alive and vital and creating rather than dying in a dark room. He has a prestigious academic position that gives him security and status. He is going to help birth a cultural revolution that will redeem German civilization. But underneath his certainty, something else is growing, a discomfort, a suspicion, because the longer he spends with Wagner, the more he notices things that disturb him. Wagner's megalomaniacal certainty first. The way every conversation eventually circles back to Wagner's genius and the world's failure to adequately appreciate it. The way Wagner cannot bear contradiction or criticism, cannot imagine that he might be wrong about anything. Friedrich, still young and uncertain about his own ideas, initially attributes this to justified confidence, but gradually he begins to see it as something else, a terrifying refusal to question himself. Then there's Wagner's need to dominate every conversation, every relationship, every room he enters. Friedrich watches Wagner interact with other admirers and realizes that Wagner doesn't really want colleagues or friends. He wants disciples, worshippers, mirrors that reflect back his genius without distortion. Wagner's anti-Semitism grows more troubling. At first it seems like casual prejudice, the kind of background noise of 19th century European culture that Friedrich has heard all his life. But Wagner's anti-Semitism is more systematic, more theoretical. He writes pamphlets arguing that Jews are incapable of creating true art, that they represent everything wrong with modern culture. He speaks of Jewish corruption of German music, with genuine hatred in his voice. Friedrich, who has Jewish friends and colleagues, who is beginning to see nationalism as a disease, finds this increasingly repulsive. But he says nothing, not yet. What right does he have to doubt? He is 24 years old and living with the greatest living artist in Europe. Surely Wagner knows things Friedrich doesn't yet understand. And Wagner's embrace of Christianity, that's perhaps the most disturbing element of all. Wagner is working on Parsifal, his final opera, which treats Christian redemption as sublime truth. The man Friedrich thought was a fellow Dionysian, a fellow affirmer of life despite its horrors, is creating art that glorifies renunciation, chastity, Christian redemption. How can this be reconciled with the Wagner who created the pagan passions of Tristan? Friedrich says nothing. Not yet. He is living the dream he thought he wanted. He cannot yet admit that the dream is curdling. In 1870, war breaks out between Prussia and France. Friedrich, despite having renounced his Prussian citizenship, volunteers as a medical orderly. He wants to participate in what he believes is a great historical moment, the unification of Germany, the birth of a new nation that might give birth to a new culture. Wagner has convinced him that this war is necessary, purifying the violent birth of something glorious. He lasts 3 weeks before contracting diphtheria and dysentery while tending to wounded soldiers. The infections leave him violently ill. He is invalided home on a cattle car, vomiting and feverish, permanently damaged. The infections leave him with chronic stomach problems and blinding headaches that will plague him for the rest of his life. His immune system is compromised. His digestion never fully recovers. The war also gives him a vision of violence that shakes his Wagnerian idealism. He sees mangled bodies, young men with limbs blown off, screaming for their mothers, men dying slowly from infections in their wounds, the smell of gangrene filling the medical tents, men made stupid by head injuries, men bleeding internally, men simply giving up and dying from despair. This is not glorious. This is not the affirmation of life through struggle that Wagner preaches about from the safety of his villa. This is just meat being destroyed. This is meaningless suffering on an industrial scale. Whatever is being born through this violence, Friedrich begins to suspect it won't be beauty or culture or transcendence. It will be something harder and colder and more terrible, but he pushes the doubt down. He returns to Basel. He throws himself into his teaching and into his first book, a work that will announce his philosophical project and cement his alliance with Wagner. The Birth of Tragedy is published in early 1872. It is unlike anything that has appeared in classical philology before. Instead of dry, scholarly analysis, Friedrich offers a visionary interpretation of Greek culture. He argues that tragedy was born from the tension between two drives, the Apollonian, representing order, rationality, and beautiful illusion, and the Dionysian, representing chaos, intoxication, and terrible truth. The Greeks, Friedrich claims, achieved greatness not by being rational and balanced, but by facing the horror of existence through the Dionysian and then creating beautiful illusions through the Apollonian to make life bearable. And he argues that this tragic wisdom was destroyed by Socrates and Plato, who introduced rationalism and the delusion that life could be understood and perfected through reason. The rest of Western philosophy, he claims, has been a long decline from tragic insight into intellectual cowardice. Philosophy became a way of hiding from reality rather than facing it. The solution? A rebirth of tragedy through Wagner's music dramas. Wagner is the new Aeschylus. The future of culture is being born at Tribschen. The academic establishment tears the book apart. His former teachers denounce him for abandoning scholarly rigor. His old mentor, Ritschl, who got him the Basel position, is quietly disappointed. Colleagues question whether Nietzsche is really a serious scholar or just a failed poet writing pretentious speculation. Future students avoid his classes, worried that studying with such a controversial figure will damage their own careers. The philologist Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff publishes a savage review titled Future Philology that mocks every aspect of Nietzsche's argument. He accuses Friedrich of ignorance, of misunderstanding the Greeks, of projecting modern German romanticism onto ancient culture. The critique is devastating precisely because some of it is accurate. Friedrich has committed professional suicide at age 27. His academic reputation is destroyed overnight. The professorship at Basel suddenly feels less like a triumph and more like a trap. He's stuck in a position he obtained under false pretenses, teaching students who don't respect him, increasingly isolated from the scholarly community he wanted to join. But he doesn't care. Or he tells himself he doesn't care, Because he has broken free from academic convention, he has announced a new philosophical path. He has aligned himself with genius. And then slowly, inevitably, he begins to see what he has aligned himself with. In 1876, Wagner finally stages his masterwork, The Ring of the Nibelung, at the New Festival Theatre in Bayreuth. It has taken decades of planning and fundraising. The theatre was built specifically for Wagner's vision, designed to his exact specifications. This is supposed to be the moment when art transforms culture, when Wagner's genius is finally recognized on its own terms, when the revolution Friedrich has been prophesying actually arrives. Friedrich attends the premiere with high expectations. This is supposed to be the great cultural event he has been preparing for, the moment when German culture is reborn through artistic transcendence. Instead, he finds himself surrounded by the people he most despises. German nationalists waving flags and talking about racial purity. Wealthy bourgeois in expensive clothes who are there to be seen rather than to experience anything. Anti-Semites who treat Wagner's mythological operas as coded celebrations of German racial superiority. Kaiser Wilhelm himself in the royal box, turning art into state propaganda. The audience is not there for artistic transcendence, they're there for spectacle and social status. And Wagner, instead of being above it all, is reveling in the attention, playing the role of German cultural savior, accepting the nationalists' embrace, basking in the Kaiser's approval. Friedrich develops a blinding headache during the second act of Götterdämmerung. The music that used to transport him now feels bombastic, manipulative, a calculated assault on the emotions rather than genuine feeling. The whole spectacle suddenly seems grotesque. Wagner's ego amplified to deafening volume, art turned into power, Dionysian truth corrupted into theatrical effects for people who wouldn't recognize truth if it destroyed them. He flees Bayreuth during an intermission, retreating to the nearby forest where he can be alone. He walks for hours in the darkness, feeling something break inside him that cannot be repaired. The gap between what Wagner claims to be and what he actually is, between the Dionysian vision Friedrich projected onto him and this bloated nationalist spectacle, has become unbridgeable. Wagner is not going to save culture. Wagner is part of the disease. And if Wagner is false, then what does that make Friedrich, who has spent 8 years preaching Wagner's gospel? What does it make all his praise, all his theorizing, all his certainty that he had found the answer to Schopenhauer's pessimism? It makes him a dupe, a disciple, exactly the kind of follower he had promised himself he would never become. The break takes 2 more years to become complete. In 1878, Friedrich publishes Human, All Too Human, a book of aphorisms that reads like a systematic dismantling of everything he believed when he wrote The Birth of Tragedy. There is no more talk of genius or tragic culture or redemption through art. Instead, there are cool, psychological observations about human nature, skepticism about grand metaphysical claims, and a deliberate embrace of scientific thinking. The book is dedicated to Voltaire, the great skeptic and mocker of pieties, a deliberate slap at Wagner's romanticism. Friedrich argues that we need to understand human behavior through psychology and science, not through metaphysical speculation. He dissects concepts like genius and art and shows how they serve the emotional needs of believers rather than describing reality. He sends a copy to Wagner. He receives no reply. Instead, Cosima sends a cold note suggesting that Friedrich's illness has affected his judgment and that he should focus on recovering rather than writing philosophy. The friendship is over, and Friedrich is alone again, more alone than he has been since he was 5 years old, kneeling beside his bed, praying to a God who wouldn't answer. He has lost his father figure for the second time. The first time, he was a child with no choice. This time, he has chosen the break himself. He has chosen intellectual honesty over comfort, chosen solitude over the warm embrace of the Wagnerian community. It's the right choice. He knows it's the right choice. but that doesn't make it hurt any less. The year is 1879, and Professor Friedrich Nietzsche is disintegrating. His headaches have become unbearable, blinding, nauseating episodes that last for days and leave him unable to read or write. They start with an aura, a strange shimmer in his vision, then build into crushing pressure behind his eyes that makes him vomit repeatedly. The only relief is to lie in a completely dark room with cold compresses on his forehead, waiting for the pain to pass. The headaches have their own rhythm, their own terrible logic. They come in cycles, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily. Friedrich learns to recognize the warning signs, a tightness in his neck, a sensitivity to light, a subtle distortion in his peripheral vision. When these signs appear, he has perhaps an hour before the full assault begins. He tries everything: cold baths, hot baths, compresses soaked in vinegar, walks in fresh air, complete rest in darkness, various medications, quinine, potassium bromide, chloral hydrate, that do nothing except add new layers of malaise to the underlying agony. The doctors he consults offer contradictory advice. One tells him he must exercise more vigorously, another prescribes complete rest. A third suggests the problem is nervous exhaustion and recommends he stop all intellectual work. But intellectual work is all he has. Without his thinking, his writing, his philosophical project, what is he? Just a broken body in a rented room waiting to die. His digestion is destroyed. Every meal a gamble about whether his stomach will accept it. He keeps meticulous diaries of what he eats and how his body responds, trying to find some combination that won't make him violently ill. Weak tea, dry biscuits, boiled rice. Even these simple foods often come back up within hours. The diary entries are pathetic in their precision. Morning, 2 rusks, weak tea, vomiting at 10 a.m. Afternoon, broth, dry bread, stomach pain by evening. Night, chloral hydrate for sleep, insufficient. Day after day, week after week, year after year, this accounting of a body's rebellion against itself. He loses weight steadily. His clothes hang loose on his frame. His face becomes gaunt, his eyes sunken. Friends who haven't seen him in months are shocked by his appearance. He looks 20 years older than his age, already moving like an old man, carefully, tentatively, as if his body might betray him at any moment. His vision is failing. He can barely see out of his right eye. The doctors can't explain it. They examine him, shake their heads, prescribe various treatments, none of which help. One specialist suggests he may be going blind and should prepare for it. Another says the vision problems are psychosomatic, a product of his nervous constitution. He learns to write with his nose almost touching the page, straining to see the words he's forming. He develops a hunched posture from bending over his desk. His handwriting, once clear and flowing, becomes cramped and difficult to read. He experiments with different papers, different inks, different lighting conditions, anything that might make the letters clearer. Eventually he discovers that he can write more easily in pencil than ink, that certain times of day are better than others, that he can sometimes manage a few hours in the morning before his eyes give out completely. He adapts. He has to adapt. The alternative is silence, and silence means death. He is 34 years old, and his body is giving up. But his mind, his terrible, relentless, brilliant mind, refuses to surrender. In May, he submits his resignation from the University of Basel. He can no longer fulfill his teaching duties. He can barely stand in front of a classroom for an hour without needing to flee from the pain. The university accepts his resignation with what seems like relief. This controversial, sickly professor who has embarrassed the institution is finally leaving. They grant him a small pension, barely enough to live on, 300 Swiss francs a year. It's a pittance, but it's freedom. Freedom from teaching duties he can no longer perform. Freedom from academic expectations he no longer cares about. Freedom to think and write if his body will allow it. And so begins the final decade of his productive life, 10 years of wandering across Europe, living in cheap boarding house rooms, writing in brief windows between illness, completely ignored by the world. He has no permanent home, no job, no family that understands him. His mother is disappointed in him. Her brilliant son, who threw away a promising career and broke his health for reasons she cannot fathom. His sister Elizabeth is becoming more shrilly Christian and Germanic, aligning herself with exactly the kind of nationalism and anti-Semitism that Friedrich increasingly despises. His few remaining friends are scattered across Europe, and he's too ill to maintain regular correspondence. He is essentially a homeless intellectual vagrant, moving from city to city based on climate and cost, always searching for some combination of weather and altitude and food that will quiet his screaming nerves enough to let him think. He spends winters on the Mediterranean, Nice, Menton, Genoa, chasing warmth and sun that might ease his symptoms. He spends summers in the Swiss mountains around Sils Maria, where the altitude seems to help his headaches. He lives in tiny rented rooms, the cheapest he can find that are still reasonably clean. His furniture is whatever came with the room. His possessions fit in 2 small trunks. He subsists on carefully calibrated diets of weak tea and dry biscuits and water, wearing blue spectacles to protect his failing eyes from the light that stabs into his brain. He takes chloral hydrate to sleep, strong coffee to wake. He medicates himself constantly, trying to create windows of functionality in the chaos of his body's rebellion. His days follow rigid routines because routine is the only thing that helps him maintain some control. Rise at dawn, or earlier if insomnia has kept him awake. Attempt to eat breakfast, usually just tea and bread. Write for a few hours in the morning if his head permits, and this is crucial, the if. More days than not he cannot write. The pain is too great, or the nausea too overwhelming, or his vision too blurred. When he can write, it comes in bursts of furious inspiration. He writes standing at a tall desk, pacing between thoughts, moving to keep his body from locking up in pain. He writes in pencil because his vision can't track ink. He fills notebook after notebook with observations, aphorisms, fragments of arguments, long solitary walks in the afternoon, always alone. He walks for hours, often covering 10 or 15 miles, thinking through ideas, composing passages in his head that he'll try to capture when he returns. The walking seems to ease something in him, the movement clarifying his thoughts, even as it exhausts his body. Early to bed, often by 7 or 8 in the evening. Then the struggle to sleep, despite the pain, the nausea, the racing thoughts. More chloral hydrate. Sometimes opium. Anything to grant him a few hours of unconsciousness. He is spectacularly, cosmically alone. The boarding houses he stays in are full of other people, tourists, invalids seeking health cures, middle-class families on holiday. But Friedrich speaks to almost none of them. He eats alone. He walks alone. He sits in his rented room alone, scribbling thoughts that no one will read. But something is happening in this solitude. In the enforced silence and isolation, stripped of all distractions and social expectations, stripped even of reliable health, he is thinking himself into territory that no Western philosopher has entered before. He is becoming himself. In 1881, during a summer stay in Sils Maria, he has what he will later describe as the central vision of his philosophy. He is walking along the lake, near a massive pyramidal rock, when suddenly the thought strikes him with complete clarity. What if this life, exactly as you have lived it, every pain, every humiliation, every loss, What if you had to live it again and again and again for eternity? The same life, down to the smallest detail, repeating infinitely. The same headaches, the same loneliness, the same broken friendships and professional failures, every moment of nausea, every sleepless night, every vision that came to nothing, every word written that no one read, all of it forever. Would you curse the demon who told you this? Would you fall to the ground and gnash your teeth at the thought of this eternal recurrence? Or could you become someone who would say, yes, I want this exact life again and again forever? This thought, which he will call the eternal recurrence, becomes his criterion for everything. Every choice, every value, every belief must be tested against this question. Could you want this moment repeated eternally? If not, you are still living according to someone else's values, still hoping for some future redemption, still denying life as it actually is. The eternal recurrence is the ultimate affirmation. It is his answer to the question that began when he was 4 years old, watching his father die. Life has no meaning. Suffering has no purpose. Death comes for everyone. And the proper response is not Schopenhauer's denial and withdrawal. The proper response is not Christian hope for heavenly compensation. The proper response is to say, even knowing all this, yes. Yes to this moment. Yes to this pain. Yes to this life exactly as it is. He writes about the idea obsessively in his notebooks, filling page after page with variations and implications, but he doesn't yet know how to present it to the world. How do you communicate something that isn't an argument but a transformation? How do you write philosophy that changes the reader rather than just convincing them? How do you convey that this isn't a metaphysical theory but an existential demand? The answer comes to him in 1882 and 1883 in the form of a book unlike anything he has written before. Thus spoke Zarathustra. It is not a philosophical treatise. It is a prose poem, a prophetic vision, a kind of inverted Bible. The protagonist is Zarathustra, named after the Persian prophet who founded Zoroastrianism, but Nietzsche's Zarathustra has come not to save humanity, but to challenge it. He descends from his mountain cave after 10 years of solitude and begins preaching a new gospel. God is dead. The old values are collapsing, and if humanity is to survive this catastrophe, it must overcome itself and create something new. Nietzsche writes the first part of Zarathustra in a 10-day burst of inspiration in early 1883. He is staying in a cheap boarding house in Rapallo on the Italian coast. The weather is perfect, clear and warm, the Mediterranean sparkling below his window, and the words pour out of him in a kind of ecstatic fury, as if the book is writing itself through him. He writes about the Übermensch, the overman, the human who has overcome humanity's need for comforting illusions and learned to create values out of the void. He writes about the death of God and what it means to live in a world without transcendent meaning. He writes about the eternal recurrence and what it demands of us. He writes about the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit, how the human must become a camel, bearing burdens, then a lion, destroying old values, and finally a child, creating new ones. The prose is unlike anything in academic philosophy. It's rhythmic, incantatory, full of parables and prophecies and songs. It reads like scripture for a religion that has no gods. The book is published at his own expense in May 1883. Almost no one reads it. The few reviews that appear are baffled or hostile. What is this? Is it philosophy, poetry, religious mysticism? The author claims to be an atheist but writes like a prophet. He attacks Christianity but uses biblical language. But Friedrich doesn't care because he knows he has written something unprecedented. He has created a new form of philosophy, one that works through images and stories and transformation, rather than through arguments and proofs. one that demands not intellectual agreement but existential commitment. He writes 3 more parts of Zarathustra over the next 2 years. Part 2 in summer 1883, Part 3 in January 1884. Written in just 10 days like the first part, another burst of inspiration that leaves him exhausted and exhilarated. The final part, Part 4, in 1885. The final part is so radical, so apparently blasphemous and dangerous that he can't even find a publisher willing to print it. He has to pay for a private printing of 40 copies, which he gives away to friends and acquaintances he thinks might understand. Not one of them understands it. Not one. His friend Franz Overbeck, a theologian, reads it with worry. Is Friedrich going mad? Has the isolation and sickness finally broken his mind? These writings seem like the products of someone losing touch with reality, someone building elaborate castles in the air. His sister Elizabeth reads it and is horrified by the attacks on Christianity and German nationalism. She begins to distance herself from her brother, sensing that his ideas could damage her own social position. Even people sympathetic to his earlier work find Zarathustra incomprehensible or embarrassing. The prophetic style seems grandiose. The Übermensch sounds like fantasy. The eternal recurrence seems like mysticism rather than philosophy. Friedrich is completely alone in his vision. And this is when the question that has been haunting him since childhood finally becomes explicit and unbearable. If there is no God, if there are no transcendent values, if everything we call morality is just a human invention, then who decides what is good? What prevents the collapse into pure nihilism when nothing matters and everything is permitted? His answer is terrifying and exhilarating. We decide. We create values. We become gods. But this requires us to overcome nearly everything we think we are. It requires us to look into the abyss of meaninglessness without flinching, to face the death of God without retreating into new illusions, to embrace the eternal recurrence without hoping for redemption. It requires us to become something that has never existed before. But there is a problem, a deep, personal problem that Friedrich cannot fully acknowledge even to himself. He is preaching affirmation, strength, power, the creation of values, and he is doing it while living in physical agony, isolated and ignored, unable even to digest his food properly, dependent on drugs to sleep and drugs to wake. How can you affirm life when your life is almost unendurable? How can you preach strength when you are weak? How can you create values out of the void when the void is eating you alive? The contradiction is not lost on him. He knows he is not the Übermensch he describes. He is not Zarathustra. He is just Friedrich, alone and sick and unread, trying desperately to transform his suffering into something meaningful. And then, in 1882, just as he is beginning to write Zarathustra, he meets someone who makes him believe, briefly, that he might not have to be alone. Her name is Lou Salome. Lou Andreas Salome is 21 years old when Friedrich meets her, a brilliant, beautiful Russian woman who has come to Rome to study philosophy. She is unlike any woman he has ever met, intellectually fearless, utterly unconventional, with no interest in traditional feminine role. She wants to live as an independent intellectual, to think and write freely, to never be owned by any man. Lou's background is as unconventional as her aspirations. Born in St. Petersburg to a Russian general father and a German mother, she grew up in a world of privilege and intellectual ferment. She was tutored privately, learned multiple languages, read voraciously. As a teenager, she became infatuated with a Dutch preacher named Hendrik Gillo, who introduced her to philosophy and theology. The relationship was intense, possibly romantic, and ended badly when Gillo proposed marriage, and Lou fled Russia for Switzerland, ostensibly for her health. Now she's in Rome, 21 years old, traveling with her mother as chaperone, but living with far more independence than most young women of her class and era. She attends lectures, she reads Spinoza and Kant, she goes to galleries and concerts, she talks to men as intellectual equals, which they find both fascinating and disturbing. She is also electric with charisma, the kind of person who transforms any room she enters. Not conventionally beautiful, her features are strong, almost masculine, but compelling in ways that have nothing to do with conventional prettiness. Her eyes are intense, searching, her voice is low and confident. She moves through the world as if she owns it, as if the normal rules simply don't apply to her. Men fall in love with her constantly, which she finds both flattering and tiresome. She enjoys intellectual discourse but has no patience for the possessiveness that men inevitably try to impose on her. She wants colleagues, friends, intellectual companions, not husbands or lovers in the traditional sense. The idea of subordinating herself to any man, of becoming someone's wife and thereby someone's property, fills her with revulsion. She has recently rejected a marriage proposal from a philosophy professor in Zurich. Before that, there was Gillo. Now there is Paul Ray, the young philosopher who has become her devoted companion and who nurses his own impossible hopes that Lou might eventually change her mind about marriage. Friedrich meets her through his friend Paul Ray, a philosopher who is also infatuated with her. Ray introduces them in Rome in the spring of 1882, thinking that Friedrich and Lou will enjoy discussing philosophy. The meeting is immediately charged. Friedrich, who is usually shy and awkward with women, finds himself able to talk to Lou about ideas with an ease he rarely experiences. Within weeks, Friedrich has conceived a plan. The three of them, Friedrich, Lou, and Paul, will live together in a free-spirit intellectual commune. They will rent an apartment in Vienna or Paris. They will study together, think together, support each other's work. It will be a purely intellectual relationship, a meeting of minds uncorrupted by conventional romance or marriage, or so he tells himself. But of course it is not purely intellectual. Friedrich has fallen completely, desperately in love. Lou represents everything he has longed for: intellectual companionship, someone who understands his ideas, someone young and vital and alive in ways that his sick, aging body no longer is. And, being Friedrich awkward, inexperienced with women, terrified of rejection, he cannot simply tell her this. Instead, he proposes marriage. Through Paul Ray as intermediary, like a character in a bad novel. Lou rejects him. She is interested in his ideas, enjoys his company, respects his brilliance, but she does not want to marry him or anyone. She wants to remain free. The whole point of her life is independence. Why would she surrender that to become some professor's wife? Friedrich tries to accept this. He tries to convince himself that a purely intellectual friendship is enough. The three of them spend time together in Italy and Switzerland, talking philosophy, taking long walks. Friedrich is happier than he has been in years. For the first time since Wagner, he feels understood. But his sister Elizabeth appears and immediately hates Lou. Elizabeth is 26 now, unmarried, increasingly bitter, wholly dependent on being her brother's caretaker and moral guardian. Lou threatens all of that. Lou is everything Elizabeth is not. Independent, intellectual, unconventional, free. Elizabeth tries to sabotage the friendship with insinuations and accusations. She writes to their mother claiming that Lou is a seductress, manipulating Friedrich and Paul. She spreads rumors in their social circle. She manufactures a scene where she accuses Lou of impropriety, trying to force Friedrich to choose between his sister and his friend. Friedrich caught in the middle, handles it badly. He wants to defend Lou, but he cannot fully break with Elizabeth. He tries to mediate, which satisfies no one. Lou, seeing the dysfunction, begins to pull away. She and Paul make plans to travel together, without Friedrich. By fall 1882, everything has collapsed. Lou and Ray go off together to Berlin, planning to establish the intellectual commune they had discussed, but without Friedrich. Elizabeth continues spreading malicious rumors about Lou. Friedrich's mother sides with Elizabeth, horrified by the thought of her son involved with such an unconventional woman. Friedrich is left alone again, feeling betrayed by both Lou and Paul, humiliated by his sister's interference, and devastated by the loss of what he briefly believed could be a genuine intellectual companionship. He writes bitter letters that he doesn't send. He contemplates suicide, seriously this time, making plans for how he would do it. He retreats to Rapallo in a state of complete despair and begins writing the first part of Zarathustra, pouring all his pain and longing and rage into the voice of his prophet. Years later, after Lou has become a famous psychoanalyst and writer, Friedrich will write that she was one of the most intelligent people he ever met. But in the moment, the rejection feels like confirmation of what he has always suspected. He is fundamentally unfit for human connection. He is too strange, too intense, too damaged. His ideas are too radical, his health too broken, his needs too complicated. His destiny is solitude, and so he embraces it. He returns to his wandering, his cheap rooms, his rigid routines. He stops hoping that anyone will understand him. He stops waiting for recognition. He simply writes, desperately, urgently, as if running out of time, which, as it turns out, he is. Between 1885 and 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche produces the most radical philosophy of the modern era. And almost no one notices. He is living a strange, liminal existence now, neither fully part of the world nor entirely withdrawn from it. His days are structured around his body's limitations and his mind's demands. He wakes early, often before dawn, because the morning hours are when he can think most clearly. He makes weak tea, forces himself to eat a piece of dry bread, and sits at his desk while the light is still grey. The writing comes in fragments now, not because his thinking is fragmentary. If anything, it's more unified than ever, everything connecting to everything else in vast, systematic visions, but because his body won't allow sustained effort. He writes in aphorisms because aphorisms can be completed in the window between headaches, a single paragraph that captures a complete thought, a page that demolishes an entire philosophical tradition. Then he has to stop, overcome by pain or nausea, or the simple exhaustion of existing in a body that's at war with itself. He fills notebook after notebook with these fragments. Some will be published, many won't. He writes about morality and truth and power. He writes about music and literature and culture. He writes about himself, trying to understand what he's become, what the suffering has made of him, whether there's any meaning to be extracted from pain, or whether pain is just pain. His solitary walks become longer and more essential. He walks for hours through whatever city or mountain village he's inhabiting, thinking through problems, testing ideas, talking to himself in whispers that occasionally become audible mutterings. People notice this strange, gaunt man in blue spectacles walking alone, gesturing at nothing, sometimes laughing at some private joke, sometimes stopping suddenly as if struck by an invisible blow. He has become a ghost of sorts, present but not really there, moving through spaces without connecting to them, alone in crowds, invisible to the world that will one day claim him as its prophet. In 1886 he publishes Beyond Good and Evil, a systematic demolition of Western philosophy's foundations. He argues that all philosophical systems are really just elaborate rationalizations for their creators' prejudices and personal needs. There is no objective truth, no view from nowhere, no escaping the perspectival nature of all knowledge. What philosophers call truth is really just the will to power expressing itself through concepts. The book is his most accessible work since The Birth of Tragedy, less prophetic than Zarathustra, more systematic than his earlier aphoristic works. He structures it carefully, 9 parts, each building on the previous, each dismantling another pillar of Western thought, on the prejudices of philosophers, on the free spirit, on the religious impulse, on morality, on natural history. He writes with surgical precision, cutting away pretense, revealing the psychological needs underlying grand metaphysical systems. It's brilliant, it's revolutionary, it should change everything. The book sells 114 copies in its first year. Friedrich pays for the publication himself and loses money on the venture. The few reviews that appear are dismissive or confused. Who is this Nietzsche? What is he trying to say? The academic establishment, still remembering his disastrous birth of tragedy, mostly ignores him. The general reading public has never heard of him. He writes to his few remaining friends with forced cheerfulness about the book's reception, pretending not to care, making jokes about being ahead of his time. But in his private notebooks the pain is visible. I am writing for nobody. I am writing for the future. Perhaps I am writing for ghosts. In 1887 he publishes On the Genealogy of Morality, perhaps his most rigorous and devastating work. Instead of asking whether our moral beliefs are true, he asks where they came from, what psychological needs and historical conditions produce them. And what he discovers is disturbing. Western morality, he argues, is not based on wisdom or divine revelation. It is based on ressentiment, the French word for a deep, poisonous resentment that the weak feel toward the strong. Unable to defeat the powerful directly, the weak inverted all values, declaring that what the strong call good, pride, power, nobility, is actually evil, and what the strong despise, humility, meekness, self-denial, is actually virtuous. This slave revolt in morality, Nietzsche claims, is the origin of Christian morality, and it has produced a culture of life denial where suffering is glorified, pleasure is suspect, and the highest virtue is self-sacrifice. We have been taught to hate life itself, to see existence as something to be endured rather than celebrated, to believe that the real world is elsewhere, in heaven, in some transcendent realm of forms anywhere but here. The genealogy is brilliant, ruthless, and deeply unsettling. It forces readers to confront the possibility that their most cherished beliefs might be expressions of psychological weakness rather than moral truth, that what we call conscience might be internalized revenge, that what we call virtue might be the sublimation of impotence. Almost no one reads it. Friedrich is living in Turin now, in northern Italy, in a small rented room on the Via Carlo Alberto. It is 1888 and he is 44 years old. His health has improved slightly, the climate suits him, and for the first time in years he is having long stretches where he can work without debilitating headaches. The clear Italian light seems to ease his eye problems. The food agrees with him better than it has anywhere else. He is productive in a way he hasn't been since his youth. The ideas are flowing now, everything he's been thinking for the past decade crystallizing into arguments he can finally articulate. He writes The Case of Wagner, finally allowing himself to fully articulate his disillusionment with his former idol. Wagner, he argues, is not the savior of German culture but its disease, a master of theatrical effects and emotional manipulation who offers the very life denial that true culture must overcome. Wagner's music is decadent, Christian, life-denying, a drug for people who want to escape from reality into beautiful lies. He writes Twilight of the Idols, a compact, brilliant summary of his mature philosophy. How to Philosophize with a Hammer, the subtitle reads. He is going to crack open the idols of Western thought and reveal their hollowness. Short chapters demolishing Socrates, morality, Christianity, German culture, everything that claims to represent truth but really represents fear of life. He writes, The Antichrist, a furious polemic against Christianity that is so extreme his publisher will refuse to release it in his lifetime. Christianity, he argues, is not just false, it is the deliberate inversion of all healthy values, a systematic program to make humanity sick and weak and life-hating. It is the greatest disaster that ever befell humanity, worse than any plague or war. And he writes, Ecce Homo, his autobiography, which begins with the words, Why I Am So Wise, and proceeds through chapters titled Why I Am So Clever and Why I Write Such Good Books. It should be comically arrogant, and it is, but it is also something else, a man trying desperately to explain himself to a world that has completely ignored him, trying to insist on his own significance before he disappears. The tone of Ecce Homo is strange, grandiose in ways that make readers uncomfortable even now. He writes about himself as if he were a world historical figure, as if his books were explosives that will detonate Western civilization. He describes his insights as if they were gifts to humanity of incomparable value. It reads like madness, or prophecy, or both. Because Friedrich knows, even if he won't quite admit it, that something is wrong. There are gaps in his memory now, moments where time seems to skip. Moments of confusion where he cannot remember what city he's in or what year it is. Strange, euphoric episodes where he feels omnipotent, capable of anything beyond all human limitations. He writes to friends about his health improving dramatically, about feeling better than ever. And in some ways this is true. The headaches are less frequent, his digestion more stable. But the letters also contain odd, grandiose claims, sudden bursts of self-aggrandizement that go beyond his usual confidence. On Christmas Day, 1888, he begins writing notes to friends that don't quite make sense. Short, cryptic messages that seem to be in code or that reference things that never happened. He signs some of them Dionysus and others the Crucified. He seems to be identifying with both the God of life affirmation and the God of self-sacrifice, unable to maintain the boundary between himself and the symbols he's been writing about. He writes to his old friend Cosima Wagner, Wagner's widow, whom he hasn't contacted in years, saying that he would rather be a Basel professor again than be God, but I did not dare push my private egoism so far as to omit creating the world on its account. Jacob Burckhardt, the great historian and Friedrich's former colleague at Basel, receives a note claiming that Friedrich has ordered all anti-Semites to be shot. Something is breaking. The boundary between Friedrich the thinker and the ideas he's been thinking is dissolving. On January 3rd, 1889, Friedrich is walking through the Piazza Carlo Alberto in Turin when he sees a horse being beaten by its driver. The horse is old and stubborn, refusing to move forward despite the carriage driver's commands. The driver is whipping it viciously, cursing it, striking it again and again across the neck and face. It's a common enough scene in 19th century Europe. Horses are machines' tools, their suffering irrelevant to the work they must perform. The driver is angry because he's behind schedule, because the horse is costing him money, because in his world animals exist only as instruments of human will. The whip cracks against the horse's flesh. The horse flinches but still refuses to move. Perhaps it's too tired. Perhaps it's reached that point where pain means nothing anymore because there's been too much of it for too long. Friedrich has seen such scenes before. Everyone has. Cruelty to animals is the background noise of urban life, unremarkable, beneath notice. But something in this moment breaks something in Friedrich. Perhaps it's the particular quality of the horse's suffering, the way it stands there, accepting the blows, defeated. Perhaps it's the driver's casual brutality, the way he beats the animal without even being angry anymore, just mechanically applying violence. Perhaps it's that Friedrich, in his exhausted, overstimulated, fragmenting state, sees in this horse a mirror of something he's been thinking about for 40 years. Here is suffering without meaning. Here is cruelty without purpose. Here is the universe in miniature, a creature being hurt because creatures get hurt. No transcendent explanation, no hidden plan, no redemption waiting, just pain and the silence of a sky that doesn't care. Friedrich runs forward and throws his arms around the horse's neck, sobbing. He is making sounds that are not quite words, animal sounds, the sounds of someone whose language has failed, whose rational mind has encountered something it cannot process through concepts. He holds the horse, and he weeps, and the driver backs away in confusion, and a crowd begins to gather. And Friedrich is somewhere else now, somewhere beyond words. Someone, his landlord perhaps, or a neighbor who recognizes him, helps him back to his room. He is still sobbing, still making those terrible animal sounds. They put him in his bed, they try to calm him, but whatever has happened is not something that can be calmed. When he regains consciousness back in his room, he is different. He is no longer quite Friedrich Nietzsche. The man who returns to consciousness is someone, something else. The boundary has dissolved. For 40 years, Friedrich has been trying to think past the illusions that make human life bearable. He has tried to face reality without comforting stories, to look at suffering without the anesthetic of meaning. He has tried to ask, what are we really when all the lies are stripped away? What can we become if we're honest about what we are? And now he has his answer, but the answer has destroyed the questioner. Over the following hours and days, Friedrich cycles through states that terrify everyone who sees him. Sometimes he sits perfectly still, staring at nothing, unresponsive to questions or touch. Sometimes he plays the piano, not music, just random crashing of keys, violent and discordant, going on for hours. Sometimes he sings Wagner's operas, the music he spent years denouncing, now the only thing that seems to reach him. Sometimes he weeps, sometimes he rages. He writes strange notes to European leaders, signing them as Dionysus, or announcing that he has just had all anti-Semites shot. He plays the piano discordantly, randomly for hours, banging the keys without melody or structure. He alternates between singing and screaming, between long silences and explosive outbursts. His landlord, alarmed, contacts Friedrich's old friend Franz Overbeck in Basel. Overbeck travels immediately to Turin and finds Friedrich in a state of complete mental disintegration. He is sometimes lucid, sometimes wildly grandiose, sometimes simply absent, staring at nothing, unresponsive to questions or stimuli. When he speaks, it's often in fragments that seem to reference his books. I am Dionysus. The crucified speaks. We have killed God, you and I. But the words are untethered from meaning now, just sounds that used to point to ideas. Overbeck manages to get him on a train back to Basel, then to a psychiatric clinic. Friedrich sometimes cooperates, sometimes resists, sometimes seems not to understand what's happening. On the train, he alternates between sleeping and singing snatches of Wagner's operas, the music he spent years denouncing, now the only thing his fragmenting mind can hold on to. Friedrich Nietzsche, the greatest philosophical mind of the 19th century, has ceased to exist. What remains is a body that will live for 11 more years, but whose mind is gone, dissolved into something that can no longer sustain coherent thought. The medical diagnosis is general paresis of the insane, typically a late stage of syphilis. The doctors point to symptoms that fit the profile: the grandiosity, the mood swings, the progressive neurological deterioration. There are rumors about Friedrich visiting brothels as a young man, though no evidence. The diagnosis seems to fit. But this is 1889, and psychiatric diagnosis is more art than science. Later scholars will question whether Friedrich ever had syphilis at all. Some suggest a hereditary stroke disorder called codicil, which would explain both his father's similar deterioration and his own. Others suggest a brain tumor, perhaps a slow-growing meningioma that finally reached a critical mass. Others still frontotemporal dementia, which would account for the personality changes and the loss of social inhibition in his final writings. But the specific diagnosis almost doesn't matter. What matters is that the man who spent his life trying to think his way past suffering, to create a philosophy that could affirm life without illusions, met the exact same fate as his father. The 4-year-old boy who watched his father's mind dissolve, who learned that prayers go unanswered and suffering has no meaning, grew up to have his own mind dissolve in precisely the same way. And there is no meaning to extract from this, no lesson, no redemption, no poetic justice, just the pure, terrible irony of it. The philosopher of eternal recurrence trapped in the one recurrence he would never choose, becoming his father. Friedrich's mother takes him home to Naumburg, to the same town where he grew up after his father died. He is docile now, mostly quiet. He recognizes no one. He has to be fed, clothed, cared for like a child. The brilliant mind that wrestled with questions of meaning and value and truth is simply gone. His mother tends to him with dutiful resignation, this son who abandoned the faith and brought shame to the family. She is 70 now, caring for a grown man who cannot remember her name, cannot control his bodily functions, cannot do anything but sit and stare. Sometimes he plays random notes on the piano. Sometimes he seems to be listening to something no one else can hear. Mostly he just exists, a biological process, without interiority. When she dies in 1897, his sister Elizabeth takes over his care. And Elizabeth has plans. While Friedrich sits in his chair staring at nothing, Elizabeth begins repackaging his philosophy for a new century. She edits his unpublished notebooks, removing passages that contradict her vision and inventing connections that never existed. She takes fragments and arranges them into systematic positions Friedrich never held. She creates a book called The Will to Power that Friedrich never wrote, compiling fragments according to her own nationalist, anti-Semitic agenda. She removes his attacks on German nationalism. She downplays his denunciations of anti-Semitism. She emphasizes passages about power and strength while ignoring the context that made them part of a more complex philosophy. She turns the house in Weimar, where she cares for him, into a kind of shrine, the Nietzsche archive. Important visitors come to see the mad philosopher, now safely neutralized, unable to contradict the version of himself being constructed. She poses him for photographs, combs his magnificent moustache, presents him as a tragic genius destroyed by his own brilliance, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration, depending on what the visitor wants to see. In 1897, a young Italian nationalist named Benito Mussolini visits the archive and is inspired by Elizabeth's version of the Übermensch. In the early 1900s, German nationalist and proto-Nazi groups begin appropriating Nietzsche's language about strength and power and overcoming, ignoring everything he wrote against anti-Semitism and nationalism. Elizabeth encourages this. She needs the attention, the funding, the sense of importance. And if that means betraying everything her brother actually believed, well, he cannot object. He sits in his chair, unaware that his life's work is being twisted into propaganda for everything he despised. Friedrich sits in his chair, aware of none of this. The man who wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite," has become a prop in someone else's drama. The man who insisted on intellectual honesty above all else is being used to legitimize lies. On August 25, 1900, he develops pneumonia. His body, which has somehow continued functioning for 11 years without a mind to direct it, finally gives up. The infection spreads through his lungs, his breathing becomes labored, then desperate, then finally stops. He is 55 years old, the same age as Wagner when they first met, the same age as his father would have been if his father had lived 20 more years. Elizabeth makes sure the funeral is a grand affair. Important cultural figures attend. Speeches are made about German genius and cultural renewal. The ceremony is Christian, full of hymns and prayers, everything Friedrich explicitly rejected, everything Friedrich would have hated. And then begins the strange afterlife of his ideas. In the decade after his death, Nietzsche becomes suddenly, explosively famous. Artists and writers who feel alienated by bourgeois culture discover in him a voice for their rebellion. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke is obsessed with him. The playwright August Strindberg claims Nietzsche as a prophet. Sigmund Freud reads him and finds uncomfortable echoes of his own discoveries about the unconscious and the drives, though Freud will always insist he arrived at these ideas independently. But the early admirers mostly get him wrong. They read him as a prophet of egoism, of doing whatever you want, of rejecting all morality in favor of individual desire. They miss the rigorous discipline his philosophy actually demands, the years of self-overcoming, the constant examination of one's own motives, the difficulty of actually creating values rather than just destroying old ones. They want the demolition without the reconstruction, the critique without the affirmation, the freedom from old values without the responsibility of creating new ones. And then, in the 1920s and 30s, Elizabeth's version of Nietzsche finds its audience. Nazi ideologues discover her edited versions and her invented will to power. They read the Übermensch as the Aryan Superman. They read his attacks on Christian morality as endorsement of cruelty and domination. They read his insistence on hierarchy and rank as justification for racial superiority. In 1934, Adolf Hitler himself visits the Nietzsche archive and poses for photographs with the now elderly Elizabeth. She is in her 80s, thrilled to be recognized, convinced that this is the fulfillment of her brother's vision, the Führer studying her brother's works. The Third Reich as the realization of the will to power. It is a perfect desecration. Nietzsche's name becomes associated with fascism, with Nazi ideology, with everything he actually despised. The man who called anti-Semitism a moral depravity becomes the intellectual godfather of genocide. The man who attacked German nationalism as a sickness becomes the philosopher of the Reich. The man who insisted on individual self-overcoming becomes the prophet of mass movements and collective identity. And for decades after World War II, this association makes him almost untouchable in respectable intellectual circles. The Nazi taint is too strong. To be interested in Nietzsche is to be suspect. Universities avoid teaching him. Philosophers distance themselves from him. His books remain in print but largely unread, carrying the stain of history's greatest horror. But then in the 1950s, a Jewish German philosopher named Walter Kaufmann begins the rehabilitation. Kaufmann reads Nietzsche's actual texts, not Elizabeth's falsifications. He goes back to the original notebooks and shows how Elizabeth manufactured and distorted. He translates Nietzsche's works into English with scholarly rigor and passionate clarity, writing detailed commentaries that explain what Nietzsche actually said versus what the Nazis claimed he said. Kaufmann's work is an act of rescue. He is a Jewish refugee who fled Germany in 1939, who lost family members in the Holocaust. He has every reason to hate Nietzsche, to accept the association with Nazism as accurate. Instead, he reads carefully, scrupulously, determined to understand what Nietzsche actually wrote rather than what his sister and the Nazis claimed he wrote. The result is revelatory. Kaufmann shows that Nietzsche explicitly and repeatedly attacked anti-Semitism, calling it a sign of cultural disease. He demonstrates that the Übermensch is not about racial superiority, but about individual self-overcoming, about becoming better versions of ourselves, not about dominating others. He reveals that Elizabeth deleted passages where Friedrich mocked German nationalism, praised Jewish intellectuals like Heinrich Heine, and expressed contempt for the very racial theories the Nazis would embrace. Kaufmann's translations bring Nietzsche into English for the first time in reliable scholarly editions. Before Kaufmann, English readers had only fragments, poor translations, or Elizabeth's corrupted versions. After Kaufmann, they have Nietzsche's actual voice, ironic, provocative, self-aware, nothing like the humorless ideologue of Nazi propaganda. The rehabilitation is slow. Many scholars and intellectuals remain suspicious. The association with Nazism is too strong, too recent, too horrifying. But gradually, carefully, Nietzsche becomes readable again, not as the philosopher of fascism, but as something far stranger and more challenging. And slowly, painfully, Nietzsche becomes readable again. French philosophers Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida discover in him the origins of their own critiques of power and truth. They find in Nietzsche a way of questioning all claims to objectivity, all assertions of timeless truth, all structures of authority that claim to be natural or inevitable. Foucault reads Nietzsche's genealogical method and applies it to madness, sexuality, punishment, showing how what we think of as natural or scientific categories are really historical constructs serving particular power relations. Deleuze reads Nietzsche as a philosopher of difference and becoming, an alternative to the entire Western tradition of seeking stable identities and unchanging essences. Derrida finds in Nietzsche a forerunner of deconstruction, someone who understood that language doesn't simply represent truth, but creates and undermines it simultaneously. These French readings transform Nietzsche from a figure of historical interest into a living presence in contemporary thought. He's no longer just someone who said provocative things about Christianity and morality. He's a resource for thinking differently about power, knowledge, identity, truth itself. American philosophers find in him resources for understanding authenticity and meaning in a post-religious age. How do we create meaningful lives when the old sources of meaning, God, tradition, objective morality, are no longer available? Nietzsche's question becomes the central question of existentialism, of much 20th century philosophy. Psychologists recognize that he anticipated many of their discoveries about motivation and self-deception. His concept of ressentiment prefigures Freud's theories of neurosis. His analysis of how we rationalize our desires prefigures cognitive dissonance theory. His insistence that consciousness is only the surface of who we are prefigures the entire depth psychology movement. By the late 20th century, Nietzsche has become what he never was in his lifetime, essential. You cannot understand modern thought without engaging with him. His questions have become our questions, His diagnosis of modernity has proven prophetic, because the crisis Nietzsche diagnosed, the death of God and the collapse of transcendent meaning, has only intensified. We live in the world, he predicted, where old certainties are gone but new values remain unclear, where we can no longer believe in objective morality but don't quite know what should replace it, where we are free in the sense of being unmoored from tradition, but this freedom feels more like vertigo than liberation. The world Nietzsche predicted in the 1880s has fully arrived in the 21st century. Religious belief continues to decline in the developed world, not through persecution, but through simple irrelevance. The old sources of meaning, faith, tradition, community, clear moral frameworks have lost their grip on vast numbers of people. We are, as Nietzsche forecast, living after the death of God, but we haven't developed what he hoped we might. The courage and discipline to create new values, to become something greater than what we were. Instead, we've developed sophisticated mechanisms for avoiding the implications of our situation. We've created elaborate therapeutic frameworks that promise meaning without demanding transformation. We've built consumer cultures that offer endless distraction from fundamental questions. We've developed political ideologies that claim to be based on reason or nature or justice, but that really serve the same function religion once did, providing certainty in an uncertain world, offering belonging in place of freedom, demanding faith rather than questioning. Walk through a modern city and you see Nietzsche's questions everywhere, usually unacknowledged, usually unexamined. The therapeutic culture that tells us to become our authentic selves. What is that but a distorted echo of self-overcoming, stripped of its difficulty and discipline? The self-help industry promising that you can create your own meaning. Isn't that amateur Nietzscheanism, the affirmation without the abyss? The political movements that try to base their claims on natural or objective morality, aren't they fleeing from precisely the abyss Nietzsche told us to face? Look at how we talk about mental health, about trauma, about the self. We've absorbed Nietzsche's insight that consciousness is only the surface, that beneath our rational self-understanding lie drives and forces we don't control. But we've medicalized it, pathologized it, turned it into something to be cured rather than understood. We want to be free from suffering, not to find ways of affirming life that include suffering. Look at how we approach meaning and purpose. We know, we cannot help but know, in this post-religious age, that there's no cosmic purpose, no grand plan, no guaranteed significance to our lives. And so we create substitute meanings, career success, personal relationships, political causes, consumer identities. Nothing wrong with any of these in themselves, but are we creating values, as Nietzsche challenged us to do, or are we just adopting ready-made meaning from the cultural marketplace, choosing from the menu of available identities rather than forging something genuinely our own? And the nihilism he warned about, the sense that nothing really matters, that all values are arbitrary, that everything is permitted, walk through a university campus or scroll through social media and tell me that isn't our condition now. We have absorbed Nietzsche's critique of morality without developing his discipline of self-creation. We have learned to disbelieve but not to affirm. We have torn down the old values but built nothing in their place. The contemporary resonance goes deeper still. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment, the way the weak seek revenge on the strong by inverting all values, maps uncomfortably onto current political and cultural dynamics across the political spectrum. His warnings about the last man, the person who seeks only comfort and avoidance of suffering, who has no great aspirations or willingness to risk anything, who wants only to be safe and entertained, isn't that a diagnosis of something we recognize in our consumerist, risk-averse, comfort-seeking culture? His insistence that truth is perspectival, that there is no view from nowhere, that all claims to objectivity mask some will to power. This has become the default assumption of much contemporary thought, often without acknowledgement. When we talk about lived experience or standpoint epistemology or positionality, we are speaking Nietzschean even if we don't know it. When we question who benefits from certain truth claims, when we ask whose interests are served by particular moral frameworks, we are doing Nietzschean genealogy. But we have also lost much of what made Nietzsche's thought bearable. He believed that destroying old values was necessary because humanity could create better ones. He thought we could learn to affirm life more fully, to become stronger and more honest, to face truth without comforting illusions. He had, despite everything, a kind of faith in human possibility, not faith in a religious sense, but faith that we are capable of more than we have shown, that we can become something greater. Do we still have that? Or have we kept his critique while losing his courage? Have we learned to tear down without learning to build? Have we mastered skepticism without mastering affirmation? There is something else, something harder to articulate. Nietzsche matters because he lived the questions he asked. He didn't develop his philosophy in academic comfort and then publish papers about it. He destroyed his health, his career, his relationships, his sanity in pursuit of intellectual honesty. He chose exile and poverty rather than compromise with comfortable lies. He could have had a normal academic career, a wife, children, bourgeois respectability, and he chose instead the life of a wanderer and a prophet and a madman. And this gives his thought a different quality than most philosophy. It isn't just clever argumentation. It's the trace of someone who was willing to look directly at what most of us prefer to ignore, the meaninglessness, the suffering, the absence of cosmic justice or purpose. And having looked, he tried to find a way to say yes anyway. He failed, of course. Or the project was cut short, depending on how you look at it. His mind collapsed before he could work out the full implications of his ideas. We are left with fragments, provocations, unanswered questions. We have his diagnosis of the problem, the death of God, the collapse of meaning, the threat of nihilism. We have the outlines of his response, self-overcoming, value creation, eternal recurrence. But we don't have the completed system, the fully worked out answer. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the point was never to arrive at final answers, but to ask the right questions. Questions like, can we create meaning in a meaningless universe? Can we affirm life knowing that suffering is inescapable and death is final? Can we face truth without the comfort of illusions? What does it mean to be human once we've abandoned all the old answers about what humans are? These aren't academic questions, they are existential ones, lived ones. And Nietzsche's life suggests how difficult, perhaps impossible, they are to fully answer while remaining sane. Which brings us back to Turin, to that January day in 1889, to the moment when Friedrich threw his arms around a beaten horse and collapsed. There are many ways to interpret this scene. The obvious reading: he had a mental breakdown triggered by physical disease. The medical reading: tertiary syphilis or a brain tumor or genetic vascular disease finally reached the point of no return. The moral reading: even the philosopher of hardness and cruelty was undone by compassion. The ironic reading: the man who preached strength was destroyed by weakness, by the inability to look at suffering without being destroyed by it. But there's another possibility, one that the scene itself suggests. Friedrich spent his entire philosophical career trying to face reality without comforting illusions. He tried to look at suffering honestly, to acknowledge the cruelty baked into existence, to see the world as it actually is, rather than as we wish it were. He tried to stare into the abyss without flinching. And what if, in that moment with the horse, he finally succeeded? What if he looked at that horse, beaten, exhausted, helpless, and saw the pure fact of suffering without any narrative to make it bearable, no meaning, no purpose, no redemption, no higher plan, just a creature being hurt because creatures get hurt. Just the universe in all its indifference crystallized in one moment of casual cruelty. What if the embrace wasn't madness, but the only sane response to a moment of complete clarity? And what if sanity simply cannot survive that level of clarity? What if the human mind needs illusions to function, and stripping them all away doesn't lead to strength, but to collapse? This would mean that Nietzsche's collapse was not separate from his philosophy, but its fulfillment, that he pushed thought as far as it could go before it broke the thinker, that the project of living without illusions is literally unlivable, that you can philosophize with a hammer, but eventually the hammer breaks you. We don't know, of course. We can't know what was happening inside his disintegrating mind, but the fact that we can ask the question, that his collapse doesn't simply invalidate his thought but deepens its challenge, says something about the territory he mapped. Return now to the parsonage at Röcken. The 4-year-old boy kneeling beside his bed, praying for his father to recover. That boy learned the first great lesson. There is no one listening. The universe does not care about our prayers or our suffering or our hopes. We are alone. It's 1849, and little Friedrich doesn't yet have the concepts to understand what he's experiencing. He doesn't know about philosophy or theology or the problem of evil. He only knows that his father is dying, that the prayers aren't working, that the adults keep promising that God has a plan, but the plan seems to involve his father screaming in agony and not recognizing his own children. This is the origin point. This is where everything that follows begins, not with books or ideas or philosophical arguments, but with a child's direct, unmediated encounter with suffering and the silence that answers prayers. Everything Friedrich will later write about the death of God, about the creation of values, about saying yes to life despite everything, grows from this moment. He spent 40 years trying to find a response to that lesson that wasn't despair. His answer, create your own meaning, affirm life anyway, overcome yourself, become who you are, was incomplete, impossible, but also somehow necessary. Because what else could he do? What else can any of us do? He could have chosen the obvious responses. He could have become bitter and cynical, declaring that since nothing matters, we might as well pursue pleasure and power without restraint. Many read him this way, but they're wrong. He could have become a quietist, like Schopenhauer, withdrawing from life, denying the will, seeking extinction. But he rejected that path as a form of cowardice. He could have returned to faith, convincing himself that his childhood doubts were wrong, that there is meaning and purpose after all. But intellectual honesty forbade that retreat. So he tried something harder, to face the meaninglessness without flinching, and then to create meaning anyway. Not to discover meaning, there is none to discover, but to create it through the force of will, through becoming something that never existed before, to say yes to life, knowing exactly what life contains, to want even the suffering to recur eternally. To become the kind of being who could do this, it's an impossible project. Maybe it's literally impossible. Maybe the human mind breaks before it can complete this transformation, as Friedrich's mind broke. Maybe we need illusions to survive, and radical honesty is a form of suicide. Or maybe Friedrich just ran out of time, his body failing before his project could reach completion. The child's question remains open. If there is no God, if suffering has no meaning, if death comes for everyone, then what? How do we live? What do we become? Different ages answer differently. Medieval Christianity answered, have faith, accept suffering as God's will, hope for heaven. The Enlightenment answered, use reason to improve the world, build progress, create justice. Romanticism answered, create beauty, feel deeply, make art from pain. Existentialism answered, create meaning through authentic choice, through engagement, through taking responsibility for what we become. Nietzsche's answer is harder and stranger. Overcome yourself. create values, affirm everything, even the worst of it, become something that has never existed. Don't settle for being human as humans have always been. Become the Übermensch, which is not a type of person, but a direction, a trajectory, an endless process of self-overcoming. And we still don't know if that's possible. We have his challenge, but not his completed answer. We have the diagnosis of our condition, but not the cure, if cure is even the right word for what he was attempting. Nietzsche gave no final answer because there is no final answer. There is only the question, recurring eternally, demanding that we respond not with theories, but with our lives, not with arguments, but with the way we face suffering, the way we create meaning, the way we choose to become. He is not dead, not really. He is still asking, still refusing easy comforts, still demanding that we look at reality without flinching and find a way to say yes anyway. And we are still trying to answer him in our therapy sessions and our existential crises, in our struggles with meaning and purpose in a post-religious age, in our attempts to create values when we no longer believe in objective morality, in every moment when we face suffering and have to decide whether life is worth affirming. The boy who learned that prayers go unanswered grew into the man who taught us that we are alone. But he also taught us that being alone is not the same as being defeated, that meaninglessness is not the same as worthlessness, that we can create what we cannot discover, that we can become what has never existed before. Whether we have the courage to actually do this, that is the question he left us, and the answer, if there is one, will not be written in philosophy books. It will be written in lives lived with eyes open, in choices made without the comfort of certainty, in moments when we embrace life knowing exactly what it costs. Friedrich Nietzsche, the boy who lost his father, the man who went mad seeking truth, the prophet who was crucified by his own honesty, he gave us no solutions. But he gave us the right question. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything.